Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of SD Times Live, a special webinar presentation. Today we're talking about how you can make your software supply chain more secure. I'm with Steve Poole. He's the developer advocate at Sonatype, and we'll be talking about many of the issues surrounding software security. But before we start, I have a couple of quick announcements. One is that this is being recorded and will be available online on the sdtimes.com website as of tomorrow. And secondly, there'll be a live Q&A, so you can type in your question at any point in the chat tab, and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, so Steve, thanks for being with us today. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Good, thank you. So, let's get into it. Big picture. What is the threat to the software supply chain?
Yeah, no, good question. It's almost as if we prepared this stuff.
Yeah.
So
who'd have thunk it?
Yeah, so just so everybody understands, I'm not going to put any slides up or pictures and stuff like that, and we're just trying to keep this a conversation. And again, if people, as we talk, if people have particularly interesting points that they want to make or questions they want to ask, then we'll jump in and do those things. Yeah. So what's the threat? So what's going on? We talk about making your supply chain more secure, and a lot of people say, "Well, I have a secure system," and actually that was maybe true when the bad guys, the bad actors, were the type that they used to be. But what's actually happening now is things have radically changed. So, in the old days, we used to have, well, how would I say this? That's even, let's say, 2 years ago, maybe.
Right.
Right.
The old
2
days.
years ago, in the old days, 2 years ago, we would have cybercrime. We still have cybercrime, but you still have cybercrime. We still have people who are doing what's called drive-by. They'll just try and break into your systems. Then if they can do that, then they'll hack a bit more and stuff like that. But if it's hard, you've got good security or enough security, then they'll move on. But what we're seeing is that automated attacks, because I'm sure everybody's heard that now, that if you turn up a server on the internet, it gets attacked within a certain number of minutes or seconds, and that's still happening because there is continuous botnets out there that are just as all they do. They just find new servers and they try and find their way in. And traditionally, it's like just a few years ago, what they were trying to do was get in and steal your data and credit cards, all that sort of stuff. Okay. Right. Now it's changed. So I think what people have to realize is that the threat and the motivations of people have changed. So we've had this enormous increase in cyber attacks now being done for state purposes, cyber warfare. And I'm sure people who are following the situation in the Ukraine will see these things coming up now, and you'll see more and more where cyber attacks are taking place that are for warfare purposes. So what people start to understand is that the motivations that the bad guys have, well, yes, it's always about making money, but now we have these people who aren't doing it for money. I mean, money's a nice side effect, but actually what they're trying to do, and this is why it's all completely different, is they're trying to get into your system because you're part of a supply chain. So, so if you're a supermarket, if you're a trucking company, if you run GPS, you name it, your business provides services to somebody else, and it's all part of this global supply chain. Right. So what the bad guys doing, the bad actors, these nation states are figuring out how to get into your systems, not necessarily to steal data, but to get in a position where they can compromise it or terminate it, whatever. Because so you can imagine that if somebody gets into your data and let's imagine a hypothetical thing. Amazon gets hacked by some nation state, and they replace all the shipping addresses for everybody to some Santa Claus or something. It's that sort of thing. and they're going to do it directly. They're going to do it. They're going to be very persistent because you are part of a supply chain they want to hack.
Right.
So in those circumstances, the threat here is, whereas before it used to be, as long as you had good enough security and you did good enough things, you were as likely to be attacked as the next person. But now your position in a commercial enterprise, your position in a supply chain may make you very, very vulnerable. And just to add insult to all this, they'll it's not only about going after the supply chain software, they go after individuals. They're very techniques, social engineering techniques to get at you personally. So it's a different type of space. Okay.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing, though, that we've seen in terms of just the enormity now of attack surfaces that are available because of the complexity of applications. We have API calls going out to everything. So now people are attacking the API as a way to get into the system or to somehow prevent the software from working. So how are they now having to deal with that? I mean, there are so many moving parts to every application now.
Yes, exactly. And
hard to defend.
It is hard to defend. And again, I'd say our defenses, we have built good defenses, but they've not been stressed, and now they're going to get stressed. And what I think, again, that people have to understand in terms of the threat here isn't just their motivations, it's also the tooling that's out there. So we've had pen testers, trying to get into systems all the time. That's a profession. We have people whose job is to break into your systems, and we employ those to check it out.
Sure.
Well, now think about those people being those sorts of skill sets being used not just to try and get into your system but actually break into your system, do horrible things to you, and then walk away without telling you, in a stealth manner. That's the thing you won't know,
Right.
And so the other thing to add to all this, because this is where we talk about the threat, the other escalation that's happening is we begin to realize that the bad guys are not just interested in exploiting known weaknesses; they now want to make their own. And so the other thing that's being targeted is things like the open source communities, which we can talk about later about the specifics there. But generally, the bad guys are trying to create their own vulnerabilities. So however they can do.
I'm sorry. Aside from open source and third-party software that people are bringing in,
Yeah.
where are some of the other weaknesses that organizations should be looking to shore up?
Well, so I think a lot of it is this them understanding how they do business and how they deliver software. So I would say what we see is there's some really simple things, like, do you manage dependencies properly? So it's the big mantra. You'll find everybody says, do you manage your dependencies correctly? And the simple answer is most people don't. Right? We look at the Log4j thing that came out recently. So if you're a Java shop, then you probably use Log4j. And I'm sure December, everybody was horror struck to see just how bad this vulnerability was. And yet here we are, a few months later, and Cernotype, the company I work for, they run Maven Central, and so they see all the downloads. And we know that 40% of the downloads for Log4j are still for vulnerable versions. So we know that people think they've got good build systems and they've got good dependency management, but actually they haven't. I'd say one of the things that people should be doing now is taking a really good look at the tools they use and start assessing them from, do they really do what I expect? And in fact, one of the things I find interesting, because I do security workshops with Java developers, and we find that even if you ask them how their dependency management systems work, things like Maven and Gradle, quite often they don't know. So I'd say, if you want to improve things, you have to understand what you've got and why it's not working. And so I'd say my number one big advice to people is to start with dependencies. Figure out how the tooling that you've got works. Write some test cases to see whether the tools that you're using to find vulnerabilities can actually find those edge cases. And if not, then think again about the tools you're using. So that'd be number one. And the second thing is build processes. The whole build cycle tends to be very homegrown and tends to have much less security around it than the product. So what you find is bad guys targeting the build system because you can have the best security in the world, but if I can get into your build system and insert some malware at the point where you're packaging it, then it doesn't matter because I've subverted all your systems. Scary world, really, isn't it?
Is it also a question of people just not keeping track of versions and updating, and when like Log4j, for instance, may have already patched and fixed the vulnerability, but people are not then just adopting that into their own systems? They're still using older versions, or as you said, even downloading the wrong versions.
Yeah, exactly. We're still running in this old mode where you can have just enough, and now we're talking about people would say, I've got time. We've got time to do that. We've got firewalls and things like that, and you may do, but what we're seeing now is, as I said, about people creating their own things. There are bad guys creating their own vulnerabilities. That means that when a vulnerability gets announced, how long do you have between that vulnerability announced and you fixing it? We used to say we used to measure in days, and it got down to minutes. And we talked about zero. You hear about 0-day exploits, where the difference between announce and exploitation is milliseconds. Well, now it's flipped. Now we have lots of evidence of people finding bugs. Right. So finding a vulnerability is a profitable occupation. If you have the right ethical mindset, then finding a bug in an application is great, in a framework is great. And what usually happens is these guys report it. They don't report these, they don't necessarily report these things anymore. We have lots of good evidence where people are being paid very large amounts of money to not report it. And that vulnerability is then being reported to a government rather than where it should normally go. And so it gets exploited. So the consequence of that is that we've moved from the point where we had a little bit of time to apply fixes to having no time, because by the time you hear about the vulnerability, it's already been exploited. So the barn door is open. You've probably been, if you were vulnerable, you've probably been attacked, or you're going to, it's just like, as soon as you hear about it, you have to do this as quickly as possible. And so that comes back to this whole supply chain thing, which is, if you're building software, which of course everybody is, you have to be able to do that quickly, automatedly, because today you've got a vulnerability, tomorrow you've got a vulnerability, the day after that. And if you can't quickly and safely respin your software, then you could get compromised.
Yeah. So clearly a lot of companies are now taking this seriously. Everybody's talking about the shift left of security and putting the onus on developers to code more securely and to use coding editors that will give you an alert if you're typing in a vulnerability, as it's happening. But they're not really skilled up in that way to handle a lot of these issues. So are you seeing enough energy and resources being put into training developers, or are organizations finding other ways around that issue, forming squads, as it were, of tester, security people, developers, all working together from the beginning?
Yeah, so yes and no. Mostly, what I think I'm really glad to see is that developers are beginning to pay attention to the fact that there is a problem. Right. But historically, we've trained developers to say it's not really your problem, because we've taken a lot of the security issues and we've said, it's a DevSecOps thing, or we have log monitoring tools, we have API gateways and things like that. And so it's in one level, we've stepped back because the skill set that you might want your developers to have, we sort of said, you don't need to do it, worry about it, somebody else is doing it. So it's good to see that developers are beginning to ask the right questions. Yes, you see situations where you have companies saying, well, we really do something together. But I think it's still quite piecemeal. I think people are still trying to figure out, what should I actually do? Because again, if you talk to developers generally, you say, security, what they tend to think of is authentication or encryption. And you start talking about like the OWASP thing. There's all these lots of wonderful education about how to design secure applications. It's not rocket science. There's lots of good advice, but people haven't really paid much attention because it's not really been seen as being part of a productivity exercise. So I think our challenge,
it's non-value added.
Yes, exactly. Let's be honest. Developers are always under that pressure, and we always adapt to those sorts of challenges. And so far, we've adapted to producing software as fast as we can at the quality that's needed, and security has not really been particularly important. And that's okay. We can evolve into we can learn how to do those things, but we unfortunately the amount of time we've got left to do that is running out.
Yeah.
So there's no real rocket science here. If you're going to do this in terms of producing better quality software, you've got to have a better, more secure pipeline, and you've got to be serious about this, and you've got to start looking at the end-to-end thing. I mean, I say one of the things our developers should do is quite simply look at how their system, their applications fits in the whole pipeline of, they've got an API gateway. There are security tools that monitor for behavior. So go look at those, see what they do, understand, have a conversation with the people who own those in your organization and say, how can we best fit? Rather than just assuming that, these are all black boxes and you just do your bit. It's like we have to sort of start working together.
Right. Well, that's certainly certainly important. So I wanted to ask you, aside from what you had just laid out about the pipeline and all that, what other steps can companies take? Well, you've painted this gloom and doom picture of, by the time you hear about the vulnerability, you're already behind the 8 ball. And
yeah,
how do you get ahead of it? What can companies do to try to get ahead of these issues?
Yeah. Well, so I said, first off, it's this idea of you've got to pay attention to security, and you've got to look at the systems that you use. So I'd obviously see a high-speed CI/CD system. So that's your first thing. You're going to say, okay, so you've got to patch vulnerabilities. So you're going to get told vulnerabilities are going to come out. You need to have systems that can apply the patches quickly. If you do it manually, then obviously you increase the risk. So you need high-speed systems that need to be doing this automatically. You've got to educate your developers, right? So we've all got to get better understanding what the challenge is. That's just, it's just like number 0 on the list is go and learn a bit more about how this works. I like the ideas of taking people through the walkthroughs of looking at application design and going, how can it be subverted? And so starting to bring the experts together. You've got developers, you've got pen testers. Well, why don't you get them to talk through? Because I think what I've seen is that if you talk to pen testers and they'll roll their eyes a lot about how application is designed. So just by getting a pen tester in to talk through to a developer how their system might be vulnerable is cool.
Right.
There are mindsets that you can start thinking about. I do this. I say you should talk about prevention, detection, and mitigation. So when you start designing your next application, it's like, what have you got in there to prevent yourself being hacked? Are you following defensive guidelines? Are you looking at OWASP? And then you look at detection, which is we're very poor at creating applications that spots the unusual behaviors happening. So we can do better, and we can start looking at building in those sort of early warning systems. I mean, they don't necessarily be a horrible bad thing has happened, but it might be, hey, this account has had $5 added, and it's had $5 added again and again. I've done it 20 times. That's an unusual pattern. We should flag it. And developers
Right.
don't think like that. And that's the other, so getting them to think about these unusual patterns about how their applications should be working. So that's one. But the big one is we're quite complacent, I think, about we've built up a whole tool suite that gives us some comfort. And I say, you've got to start again. You've got to look at those tools. You've got to prove to yourself that the tools that you've got, the scanning tools, the vulnerability patching tools, actually do what they say. Because, okay, it's a bit doom and gloomy, but there are lots of people out there who have produced tools that say, hey, this will fix everything, and there's lots of snake oil guys out there because it's such a lucrative business. So it's those sorts of things. It's like, okay, if the tool says it does this, have you got some test cases? Can you prove that works? And then the final thing in terms of looking at the tools you use is we're now moving very strongly into a world where you need intelligence, you need information. So where does the information come? If you buy a tool from a company, excuse me, and their information comes from the public space, that's one level. But if they have their own security researchers, that's another level. If they have literally good relations with the dark web, that's another level. So before you just invest in the cheapest one, go and look at which ones have the biggest depth of information, because it's the intelligence that you need into the tools, because you don't have time to do that stuff. So I think they're a bit fluffy in what I'm saying here, but at the end of the day, they're all fairly straightforward things, and it's just a matter of flipping your head around from just going, I don't worry about security, to saying, oh, I do care about security. So what does that mean?
And of course, now, getting back to the tools that I'm sorry, go ahead. Finish your point.
No, I was just going to say so what I was going to say was that once you realize that having high-speed CI/CD systems make you safer, you soon realize that they improve your productivity because you've dealt with all those human parts, right? Once you realize that code quality is also, the poor code quality is also makes you vulnerable, and you start worrying about code quality and put tools in place for that, all these things, and you improve the communications between your team members. You're doing it for security purposes, but when you finish, what you've actually got is a much slicker engine, and it just produces higher quality code faster, because you've taken out those sort of nasty edges.
Which some people would call value stream management, but that's a different story altogether. So I wanted to ask you about AI in a lot of the tooling that could perhaps help developers. As I said, I know there's some software available that as you're writing your code, if you're writing a vulnerability, you get an alert or you get flagged and things like that. How big of a role is AI going to ultimately play in helping us win this security war?
Oh, good question. I think it's got to play a big role because we're looking at trying to identify two types of thing. We're trying to identify when human being developers do something that's non-optimal. So as you say, there's AI turning up in IDEs, looking at code and telling you that's a bad pattern. It's at early stages at the moment, but you can see that could be quite valuable. And to be told, I've just done an SQL injection thing, but I didn't realize, that's very valuable. But I think for me, the big thing is going to be on the behavior detection. My system is not working the way that I thought it should do. And I think that's where you see the AI coming in, where you can imagine them literally monitoring your application to see what looks like a healthy application, and then if the behavior changes, then flag it up, because you've got a human being and he's going to try very, very hard to break any of the simplistic detection systems. So you just need smarter stuff to find that. This is going to be another war, another race, I imagine. A different sort of arms race. Yeah.
Sounds like it. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
you mentioned OAuth a couple of times and SQL injections and things like cross-site scripting. These have been showing up on this list for like 20 years.
Yep.
And as you say, it's not rocket science, but yet we're not even solving those problems that have been known for 20 years. Is
Yeah.
it just a lack of awareness, a lack of caring, a lack of funding? People say, well, I can live with it. What is the problem?
It's one thing.
I feel like we've had
Okay.
this conversation before,
Yeah.
right? By
Yeah.
the
But
way.
it's one thing, right? The one thing is developers are too helpful, right? Developers, if you look, open source, all this sort of stuff, we're all very good at helping each other. We create fantastic tools
Right,
and we add
right,
features and features and features. And then as a developer, we consume features, but we don't realize what we've consumed. Log4j is a really good example of that, Log4Shell, where a bunch of good features on their own came together and gave the bad guys access. Cross-site scripting is usually, somebody builds it in because it makes life easier for a developer. I just want to allow HTML in that space unbounded. Okay, then I can do that for you. And the next thing, somebody figures out how to control what data goes in. So I'd say it's primarily that developers, I don't say too trusting, but we have this approach to life that says we'll help each other out, we'll build great tools and share them. And that's all based on our understanding that open source is this altruistic place where
right.
bad things only happen by accident. And unfortunately, that is
Not the
true, but
reality.
unfortunately, it is not the reality anymore. And it's yeah. So there we are.
Right.
Another gloomy thing. Yeah, but I would say, but it's still, this is
I
all
think
for
I'll go
easy
drink
fix.
some Drano right now. This is
Yeah,
really cheering me up.
but it's fixable. It's an awareness thing. It's getting to developers to understand that their choices are optimal, and as we just said, primarily they're driven by productivity. So you can imagine productivity often means I'll do something that's flexible because I think I know I'm going to do it next time, and that's quite understandable. So we need them to understand that there are other
Right,
parts to the choices, and they need to understand that.
right.
Yeah.
Now, how much is this supposed need for speed causing a lot of these issues that, this pressure is coming down from sea level? We need this product out the door today, or where, you hear these draconian stories that if your website is 2 seconds slower than your
Yeah.
competitors, everybody's going to leave you and go to him. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the messaging that's out there. How much of that is
I
behind a lot of the security problems?
I agree. I think that's a good point. I think it is productivity, delivery of value is a competitive advantage. I mean, absolutely.
Right,
So I'm thinking of an example of a few years ago where I had a conversation with a fashion house, and they were telling me their story about that if they saw something they had in stock turning up on TV, they saw some actress wearing with a handbag. If they could get that item onto the front of their web page of their store, not just there, but actually themed, within 2 hours, they made loads of money. Um, and I was involved in that because at the time they were taking like 3 weeks, and they were going, but we know that when we managed to achieve it through Herculean things, it was a enormous beneficial. So absolutely, I think we are all looking at that. You look at all the technologies out there that are coming, the cloud stuff, serverless, all these things, they're all about how quickly can I do something.
right,
So I'd say it's amazing. It's a massive pressure on developers to be productive because it's a business differentiator.
right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So let me just ask you, just for maybe a final thought to kind of sum up for our listeners here, and they have like a solid takeaway.
Okay, so I'd say solid takeaway is you've got to start looking at how you educate your developers around for security matters. Figure out how you bring all the people in your organization together to consider this challenge, and then take a look at the technologies that you're relying on today and make sure they're actually delivering the value you need, because the world has changed, and now we have a different type of bad actor out there, and you need to deal with that reality. I'd like to end this on a high note, but I would say we can deal with all these problems. We just got to be aware that this is the new reality.
Excellent. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Steve Poole, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you.
We'd certainly like to thank Sonotype for sponsoring today's session. And I also would like to thank all of our attendees who joined us here today. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. So until next time, once again, I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times. So long for now.